All right, so I'll be talking to you about three things today. 1, eco-terrorism. 2, the International Criminal Court. 3, legal personhood. What's going to tie all of those together is a theme of eco-extremism. So we'll be talking about some of the extreme ways to combat climate change. Before I get into any of that, though, I'd like to quickly remind everyone that we're on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis. We thank the Métis for the continued use of their land. But now we'll be heading everywhere throughout this presentation. So a bit of backstory before I get into it. This presentation sprung forward from a climate change class that I'm taking. We had to walk in with a proposal for how we want to combat climate change from a country's perspective. So I knew right away that when I was going into this sort of we're having a mini conference, I knew that I wanted to go with something extreme, I wanted to go with something radical. The reason for that is that once you go in with something radical, you can compromise, right? If you go in with something that's a mild approach, it's much more difficult to make that sort of change. The big thing that I want you to walk away with from this presentation is just the idea that there are some unconventional ways to solve climate change, that we don't just have to stick to the routine barriers that we always do, that there are different things. One of the main things that I focused on throughout this presentation is the idea of punitive measures. So we talked about this a lot in class. First of all, I think that we can easily agree that climate change is a real problem. We've heard a lot about why the status quo is bad, how the Earth is changing. The current approaches are mostly throughout accord systems or incentives to try and make your company better. But we see that a lot of companies just don't buy into this. We think that punitive measures are the way that we instill change, are the way that we force people to change, right? So on that note, I introduce you to eco-terrorism. Oh, right. I'm presenting you to three main ideas today, which, as many of you know who've given a 15-minute presentation, 3 ideas is a lot, so you're just getting the headlines today. Laugh, please. Okay. Thanks so much. So eco-terrorism, number 1, is something that's really in need of a rebranding. We think that it's more of a sort of militant environmentalism. It's still highly illegal, but we don't necessarily buy into the idea that it's terrorism per se. Why is that? Because terrorism tries to instill terror in the main public, whereas eco-terrorism sort of is targeted at corporations. They want corporations to fear environmental movements. They want corporations to fear environmental activists. So a little bit of backstory on eco-terrorism and what it looks like. So in 2001, the Earth Liberation Front was the top domestic threat in the USA. Eco-terrorism often tries to combat property, okay? So they'll burn down things like buildings, which we'll be talking about in a second, but they don't necessarily try to attack people, which is one of the main distinctions, I think, between another type of terrorism. Also, quick signpost, if you look up the word terrorism on Wikipedia, eco-terrorism is listed in a separate section, so it's not one of those main things. So what do we like about this specific movement? Or let's talk about a few examples first of all. So in 1980s, tree spiking was very common. So what tree spiking is, as many of you who have worked with trees know, you can take a core of a tree really easily, or you'll watch trees grow around things physically, so you can watch the tree grow around a building, that sort of thing. But logging is a real problem. So what a lot of environmental activists would do is they would physically nail in large metal spikes into the tree. The impact of this is that when you go to either chop down the tree or when you go to a lumber factory, eventually the machinery, the saws, are going to break, right? Either the chainsaw that cuts it down will break or the sawmill will break, right? What that does is it mechanistically decreases the value of trees because you have to put in all of this effort to repair the equipment, right? So that was really common in the 1980s. What ultimately ended tree spiking is that there was a death at a US factory where the sawmill literally exploded when a spike went through it, severely damaging the operator. And then tree spiking basically ended in the 1980s, or at least in America. Not common today in other parts of the world either. So what eco-terrorism looks like today is more or less it's acts of arson. So if you guys saw the quick little 6-second Vine that I put up talking about eco-terrorism, it was explosions. Explosions are largely inaccessible, particularly because a lot of these people or groups that are doing eco-terrorism don't have the means to literally blow things up. So instead they'll just burn down a building that's really doing a bad job of polluting. Today, eco-terrorism is used only in extreme situations. So there's an example on there about Greenpeace, which I'll be talking about in a second, but it's more often when a company or a factory is polluting heavily into a water supply that people drink from, right? So if it's literally impairing your quality of life, eco-terrorism is one of the main solutions that comes up. The Greenpeace example that comes up here, not sure if it's fully qualified as eco-terrorism, but for some reason that's how the media chose to brand it. They said that these are eco-terrorists. What happened is that there was a factory that was doing some heavy pollution. I just had a really bad track record with the environment. I think we can all buy into this without me giving too much analysis. What Greenpeace decided to do was they sent a group. Number 1, they did some eco-vandalism, so they went up and spray painted the word Gordon across the side of the pipe, which was just a person who was fundamental in the movement sort of thing. But they also tried to do some monkey wrenching. They tried to do some vandalism to the equipment so that it wouldn't be able to work. They blocked the smokestack, right, so that theoretically things would blow up. What ultimately happened, though, is they did a pretty bad job. So one of the reasons why they got off and why they could say climate change is a legal offense is because they didn't like actually damage property that much, sort of thing. But like that's sort of the main goal of eco-terrorism, is to damage property. So what are the impacts for climate change? One, eco-terrorism is one of the things that I want to focus on, or one of the ideas that I thought about in my presentation, just because it's so accessible to everyone. When we think about a lot of changes to climate change and a lot of the proposals that come up today, you either A, if you want to like subscribe to something like veganism, you have to be like wealthy, you have to be able to do all of these things. You have to be like able to afford things, right? Or B, you have to be powerful. For example, a lot of the ways that we try to combat in climate change and that sort of thing is we focus on like the government can do this, or like the industry can develop new technology. Eco-terrorism is something that's accessible to anybody. And we think that like, A, burning down key polluters has like a huge impact, right? We like see that as a benefit, but we think that ultimately, one of the reasons why we didn't, or why I didn't choose to pursue this, is because of the ramifications. We think that like, essentially eco-terrorism demonizes the environmental movement. It was a lot more common when people didn't buy into the idea of climate change, but today we're at the stage where we don't necessarily need eco-terrorism, which is why I chose not to pursue it. Which brings us on to our next idea, which is the idea of the International Criminal Court. So like, first of all, we had something illegal where people are going to jail. Now we have something where we're sending people to jail. Let's talk about what the International Criminal Court is. It's a branch of the UN. It deals with the heavy crimes, like the worst crimes of humanity. It's commonly referred to as the court of last resorts. It only focuses really on genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. They've only prosecuted about 44 individuals. They only prosecute individuals. It's very important. And it's when the countries that like host these individuals is either unwilling or unable to prosecute those individuals. It functions through a system of state buy-in. So the only way to be like pursued by the ICC is if, like, one, you're a member of the ICC, which most states are, or two, if you offend a member of the ICC. So for example, there's like this huge political idea about like Israel, Palestine. Neither of them are states that are in the ICC, but if one of them joined the ICC, they could like, the other person could be prosecuted, but they would also likely be prosecuted because both those states have a lot going on right now. The reason why the state buy-in system isn't ideal for a lot of the crimes that they try to pursue is because states like the Philippines, which currently did some bad things. So they just chose to like leave the International Criminal Court, and because these were domestic issues, the International Criminal Court no longer has power over them. So what makes the International Criminal Court so great for environmental crimes is the idea that like often when you're committing any sort of environmental crime, you're affecting your neighbor states, right? We think that the way water pollution and air pollution travels means that the International Criminal Court basically has jurisdiction over anything in terms of environmental crimes. What they do right now is they sort of have, quote unquote, an environmental focus. They've newly introduced that, which you see in a lot of the headlines. What that looks like is basically if you commit genocide and environmental degradation, you're definitely going to jail, right? They like sort of prioritize that, but they don't strictly look at environmental crimes, which is something that we think that they should do. So what are the climate so like if they choose to focus on just the environment, what that looks like mechanistically is probably any sort of environmental crime that has international and or intergenerational effects. So if you think of something like the BP oil spill or one of those major environmental crimes, we could see like how the International Criminal Court would be able to prosecute individuals, not just of like CEOs of companies is one thing that like can happen, but also leaders of countries. Like Brazil's leader is listed on there because he's also got some problematic issues going on. So it could really allow the world to prosecute, quote unquote, the big bads, the federal leaders and the CEOs who currently can't go to jail, who are like literally meet the definition of the International Criminal Court, because like in a capitalist society, we're often unwilling to put these people in jail, and we're often unable to because of white collar crime and the way that people can get away with it. So what are the impacts on climate change? One, punitive measures, which is like the main thing that I'm talking about. It really dissuades people and corporations specifically from like polluting in any sort of way. B, by putting like your key polluters in jail, you have like removed a key polluter, which is great. But what I think is most important that we get in through the International Criminal Court is the idea of discussion. You get corporate fear when you see people going to jail, when you see other CEOs and when you see other federal leaders going to prison, which is literally, it cannot happen in many cases right now. You like get a big narrative, you get a political discourse going on. The other fun way that I've like framed this before is if anybody has read the Harry Potter books, there are the 4 unforgivable curses, right? Which like the ICC sort of has that power over the quote unquote unforgivable curses of modern life. They literally pursue like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. So just by putting environmental crimes up in that slot, what you're doing is you're creating a really big narrative. You're allowing people like social perception of environmental crimes will really change. One of the reasons why I didn't actually decide to pursue the International Criminal Court is because the country that I was assigned for this class would probably go to jail. So I was like, that's probably not like in the best interest of the country, which brought me on to idea number 3. the idea of legal personhood. So this is like something that you're seeing a lot more commonly today. It's first of all like mainly a social movement, but it's also a political movement. The first two things that I've talked to you today about deal with a lot with like how we're going to punish corporations or how we're going to cause corporations to change. Granting legal personhood to land or to rivers or to air deals sort of more with the day-to-day interactions with the environment, right? People who own land in general can be subject. Again, what we see is sort of judicial powers, which we'll be talking about in a second. But first of all, let's go through what legal personhood looks like. There's a lot of examples on there. Many of you might have heard of them. They're all highly publicized. Like a river in New Zealand was granted legal personhood. The reason for that was the Maori tribe thought that it was spiritually special to them, that it was sort of a part of their tribe, right? Lake Erie, not in Canada, but in the United States, I think, was also granted legal personhood because the citizens were like depending on it for water quality and because the pollution had become so severe. So what it looks like when you give land or when you give pieces of nature legal personhood is you give them human rights. So like instead of this just being an environmental problem, it's a human rights problem when people choose to pollute, when they don't choose to respect the environment. So what it looks like sort of for the rivers and lakes up there is the idea that there's like sort of a panel of experts who like can tell the judicial system like, hey, this is against what we want for the river, that sort of thing. They speak on behalf of the river because as we know, like one of the main problems with granting legal personhood to non-human bodies is that these bodies cannot speak on behalf of themselves. What it looks like on a more widespread scale, which is what I considered doing for my presentation, is the government choosing to grant legal personhood to like literally all pieces of land, in which case you have to sort of look at it more like, I've heard it framed as a marriage and also as like a child. So if you think about land as a dependent of yours, the same way you can't like treat your child badly, you wouldn't be able to treat your land badly. So your land functionally would still probably exist the same, a lot of the same practices would happen, but the court would have the power to pursue you, or to pursue anybody who damages their land severely. And say like, hey, you're actually violating human rights. We also think that there's a huge social perception, which again, I should talk about in a second. The precedent for this, number one, it's already existing in several places, but also corporations actually have legal personhood, right? So legal personhood isn't just something that exists for a lot of people, it exists for non-human bodies. That's for like specific types of corporations that need human rights for some reason. Not super sure why, but also animals can often be granted legal personhood if they're like super endangered. We heard a lot about the whales. As far as I know, they do not have legal personhood, but there can be, special instances of like almost not even endangered, virtually extinct animals can get that legal personhood status, or like individual apes who are deemed part of like the collective society could get that legal personhood status. So that's the precedent. What's the climate change impact? Number one, judicial systems get unprecedented power to pursue environmental crimes, which again is something that we think that is hugely beneficial. We think that punitive measures are great, and that if you can send people to jail, if you can fine them for treating the environment improperly, we think that you get a better society. We think that climate change can sort of be mitigated. But number two, you get that social system. Again, you get that political discourse, which I've really been trying to tell you is important today. We think that if you like say that land is on the same level of people for rights, we think that a lot of people, even people who would be unaffected by the movement, just sort of see a perceived value increase of land. They see a perceived value increase of the environment in general. So what have I told you today? I've given you some really unconventional ideas about how climate change, how we can impact it. I've given you 3 ideas that I ultimately choose not to pursue, but I think that they were fun. They were fun ideas, and when after I'd done all this research, I was like, I need to present them somewhere. And then I saw Our Common Future and was like, wow, guess who's going to talk about eco-extremism? So thank you so much for listening. Do we have any questions?